"Ma'am, the family readiness brief is in the other tent," he said, his voice loud enough to be heard over the hum of the generator. He gestured vaguely to the east. "You must be lost." Bessie Thornton did not turn her head, her eyes still tracking the movements of a young captain briefing a logistics route on a digital map. She remained perfectly still, her posture a rigid architectural thing that decades of habit had made second nature. It was a stillness that seemed to absorb the kinetic energy around her. The staff sergeant, accustomed to immediate compliance, took a half-step closer, placing himself in her line of sight. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. For your safety, you really need to be with the other spouses." Only then did she turn to look at him. Her eyes were a pale, clear blue, and they held his gaze without a flicker of intimidation or confusion. There were fine lines at their corners, etchings of a life lived largely outdoors under unforgiving suns. "I'm not looking for the family readiness brief, Sergeant," she said. Her voice was quiet, yet it cut through the noise of the tent with unnerving clarity. It was a voice that held no tremor of age, only a low, steady resonance. The Ranger's polite smile became a thin, taut line. This wasn't going as expected. The old woman wasn't flustered. She wasn't apologetic. She was just watching him. "Okay, well, whoever you're here to see, I can have someone from the command post escort you. We can't have civilians wandering around the tactical operations area. It's an OPSEC issue." He was using the jargon deliberately, a subtle tool to assert his position and her lack thereof. She simply held his gaze. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be." His patience, a shallow reservoir to begin with, evaporated. The helpful soldier persona vanished, replaced by the NCO. "Ma'am, I need to see your credentials." Now, without a word, Bessie reached into the pocket of her tweed jacket and produced a simple laminated card on a lanyard. It identified her as a Department of the Army civilian consultant. Her photo, taken years ago, showed the same steady eyes, though her hair had more steel than silver then. Staff Sergeant Cutler took the ID and scrutinized it as if searching for a flaw in a counterfeit bill. He turned it over and over. "Bessie Thornton. Consultant," he read aloud, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Consultant for what? Morale and welfare. This doesn't grant you access to the exercise command tent. It grants me access to precisely where my statement of work requires me to be," she replied, her voice still unnervingly even. Around them, the activity in the tent had subtly shifted. Conversations at nearby tables lowered in volume. Heads turned. A public confrontation between a Ranger NCO and a grandmotherly figure in a red coat was better than any training scenario for capturing attention. Cutler felt the eyes on him, and his irritation hardened into resolve. He was not going to be made a fool of by some confused old woman, no matter how stubborn she was. He saw a small, tarnished silver pin on the lapel of her jacket, just above her ID. It was a pair of wings, old-fashioned and worn smooth with time. Probably a keepsake from her husband or father. It only deepened his conviction that she was a misplaced dependent. These credentials could be expired. They could be fake, he said, holding her ID up. "The procedures for civilian access have been updated. We have biometric scanning now. You probably don't even remember the current protocols. They change every year." He was talking to her as one might speak to a child who had wandered into traffic, a maddeningly patronizing tone that grated on the ears of some of the older NCOs in the tent. "Sergeant," Bessie said, her voice dropping a fraction of a degree colder. "The protocols for professional courtesy, however, seem to be timeless. Or have they been updated as well?" A few soldiers nearby coughed to hide their smirks. Cutler's neck flushed a dull red. He was losing control of the situation. He felt a need to reassert his authority, to make an example. "This is a secure area, and you are an unsecured element," he snapped, his voice rising. "I am this tent's NCO in charge of security. You will come with me to the main gate for verification. If you refuse, I will have you escorted." As he spoke, his thumb brushed against the worn silver pin on her jacket. The metal, though dull, seemed to hold a latent coldness. For the briefest of moments, the smell of diesel and damp canvas in the tent was overwhelmed by a phantom scent of jet fuel and the icy rush of a slipstream. Bessie's mind didn't wander, but a memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp as broken glass. The roaring vibration of a C-130 floor, the shudder of flak 1,000 feet below, the clipped command in her headset, the green light flooding the cabin over a dark, sleeping landscape called Panama. The pin was not a keepsake. It was a receipt. She calmly reached out and took her ID back from his hand. Her fingers were steady, her grip surprisingly firm. "That will not be necessary, Staff Sergeant. Your superiors are aware of my presence." "My superiors?" Cutler let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Ma'am, I seriously doubt the task force commander is tracking your movements." Now are you going to come with me, or do I need to call the MPs? The threat hung in the air, ugly and final. He was escalating this to a point of no return, doubling down on his assessment of her as a dotty, interfering old woman. He was sure of his ground, secure in his uniform and the authority it represented. He saw her gray hair, her tweed jacket, her age. He did not see the foundation of rock-solid discipline she stood upon. In the back of the tent, leaning against a stack of Pelican cases, a first sergeant named Rodriguez had been watching the entire exchange. He was a lifer, a man whose face was a roadmap of deployments from the first Gulf War to the last. He had been shaking his head in a mixture of pity and disbelief. The staff sergeant was a good NCO, a stellar ranger, but he had a blind spot the size of a C5 Galaxy. When the woman had quietly taken her ID back, Rodriguez had heard her name clearly. Thornton. The name echoed in the dusty corridors of his memory. Thornton. It wasn't a common name in the circles he ran in, but he'd heard it before. Long ago, when he was a terrified private, his first drill sergeant, a grizzled veteran of operations most people had never heard of, used to tell stories, legends really, to scare the recruits straight. Stories of NCOs who were harder than coffin nails, leaders who could navigate by the stars and live off the land for a month. And there was one name that always came up, a name spoken with a kind of reverent awe, a Sergeant Major Thornton. A ghost, a legend. He'd always assumed the legend was a man, but watching this woman, her back as straight as a rifle barrel, her gaze as steady as a fixed bayonet, a cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. He'd seen that posture before, in the most formidable command sergeants major he had ever served under. It was the bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime demanding and enforcing the highest standards, starting with themselves. The Ranger was now reaching for his radio handset, his expression set in a grim mask of satisfaction. He was about to make the call. Rodriguez didn't hesitate. He slipped out the back flap of the tent, pulling his own radio from his vest. He keyed the command channel, his heart pounding a little faster than usual. Dragon TOC. This is Lancer 6 Romeo. Over. Go ahead, Lancer 6, a bored voice replied. I'm at the AANDP tent. Tell the big man, tell General Merik, that a civilian consultant named Thornton is down here, and you might want to tell him that one of the Ranger NCOs is about to have her arrested. There was a pause. Did you say Thornton? Spell it. Rodriguez did. Trust me, he added, his voice low and urgent. Just pass it up, fast. Inside the cavernous, air-conditioned expanse of the Task Force Dragon Tactical Operations Center, the message was relayed from a junior radio operator to a major, who then carried it with a puzzled expression to the exercise commander himself. Major General Merik was a two-star, a man whose career had been a steady upward climb. He was focused on a complex digital overlay of the battlefield when his aide approached. Sir, a call from First Sergeant Rodriguez with the 4th Brigade. It's unusual. Merik waved a hand, annoyed at the interruption. What is it, Major? Sir, he reports that a DA civilian consultant named Thornton, Thornton, is in the plans tent, and a Staff Sergeant Cutler from the Ranger Detachment is— Merik froze. He slowly turned from the glowing screens, his expression unreadable. The name hung in the air like a chord of dissonant music. He looked at his aide, his eyes narrowed. Thornton, did you say Bessie Thornton? The first name is Bessie. Yes, sir. A silence fell over the command group. Merik stared into the middle distance for a long moment, a lifetime of memories and stories flashing behind his eyes. He had been a fresh-faced lieutenant at Fort Bragg when he'd first heard the name, spoken in hushed, respectful tones by NCOs who had forgotten more about soldiering than he would ever know. Get me her file, Merik said, his voice quiet but carrying an intensity that made the major jump. Now, and get my driver, and find the brigade command sergeant major. Tell her to meet me at my vehicle 5 minutes ago. On a nearby terminal, an analyst typed in the name. A file flagged with an unusual number of security caveats popped up. The major's eyes widened as he scanned the first page. He looked over at the general, his face pale. Sir, my God. The screen displayed a service record that was the stuff of military folklore. Bessie Thornton, Command Sergeant Major, retired. Enlisted 1979. A list of schools that read like a special operator's wish list. Ranger School, Class 485, one of the first 3 women to graduate a brutal unpublicized trial program. Master Parachutist. Pathfinder. Jump Master. A combat infantryman badge with a star, indicating service in 2 separate wars. A bronze star with a V for Valor. A silver star. Her assignment history was a tour through the flashpoints of American history. Operation Urgent Fury in Grenada. Operation Just Cause in Panama. where she made a combat jump with the 75th Ranger Regiment. Desert Storm, Task Force Ranger in Mogadishu, Somalia. Multiple tours in both Iraq and Afghanistan as one of the first women assigned to Direct Action Special Operations Task Forces, her role classified but hinted at in citation narratives. She had been a platoon sergeant when the idea of a woman leading male infantrymen was unthinkable. She had been a first sergeant in a rifle company that saw more combat in 1 year than most battalions saw in a decade. She retired as the command sergeant major of a unit whose name was known only to a select few in the Pentagon. General Merik was already shrugging on his body armor, his face a mask of cold fury. "She's not a consultant on morale and welfare," he growled to his aide. "She's here as my personal guest to evaluate our NCO leadership and tactical decision-making. I invited her. That ranger is standing on a live grenade and trying to pull the pin." Back in the GP tent, Staff Sergeant Cutler had made his decision. Bessie Thornton's calm defiance was a challenge he could not ignore. He interpreted her silence not as strength but as the stubborn confusion of old age. "All right, ma'am, you've had your chance," he said, his voice hard. He gestured to a young specialist standing nearby. "Sparks, get on the net and call the Provost Marshal. Tell them we have an unauthorized civilian in the TOC, possible fraudulent credentials. We need an escort to take her for processing." He looked back at Bessie. "And we'll be confiscating that pin. Unauthorized wear of awards is a serious offense. These old things have rules, you know. You can't just wear them because they belong to your granddad." It was the final, arrogant overreach. The accusation of stolen valor, layered with the condescension of a young man explaining the world to someone who had seen it burn and be rebuilt a half-dozen times, was the last straw. The atmosphere in the tent became thick with a shared, unspoken horror. The other soldiers knew, on a primal level, that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Just as the specialist reached for his radio, a sudden sharp sound cut through the tent's ambient noise. The screech of tires on gravel, the slamming of multiple vehicle doors, the crunch of heavy boots moving at a dead run. The tent flap was thrown open so hard it slapped against the canvas wall. Sunlight flooded the interior, silhouetting 3 figures. Even in silhouette, the central figure was unmistakable. The 2 stars on his chest plate glittered. Major General Merik strode into the tent, his eyes scanning the scene with the predatory focus of an apex predator. Flanking him was his brigade command sergeant major, a formidable woman whose crisp uniform and steely expression radiated pure authority, and his aide, who looked profoundly uncomfortable. The entire tent erupted in motion. "Attention!" someone bellowed. Chairs scraped, soldiers scrambled to their feet, and a wave of salutes rippled through the room. Cutler, his face instantly draining of all color, snapped the most rigid salute of his life, his arm trembling slightly. General Merik ignored him completely. He ignored everyone. His eyes locked on the old woman in the red tweed jacket. He marched directly to her, his boots thudding on the plywood floor, and came to a halt a perfect 12 inches in front of her. He drew himself up to his full height and executed a salute so sharp, so precise, it could have been a page from a drill and ceremony manual. "Sergeant Major Thornton," he said, his voice ringing with a deep, genuine respect that stunned the onlookers into absolute silence. "It is an honor to have you observing our exercise. I apologize for not greeting you personally when you arrived." Bessie Thornton looked at the general, a man who commanded 10,000 soldiers, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of her head. "General Merik, you're looking well." The general dropped his salute and turned, his gaze sweeping over the assembled soldiers before finally landing on the petrified Staff Sergeant Cutler. His eyes were chips of ice. "Does anyone in this tent know who this woman is?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The silence was absolute. "This," the general said, his voice rising with each word, "is Command Sergeant Major Bessie Thornton, retired. While most of us were learning to tie our boots, she was one of the first women to ever pass the Ranger course. That pin on her jacket, the one you were about to confiscate, Staff Sergeant, is a master parachutist badge with a combat jump device. She earned that star 30 years ago over Panama, jumping in with the very regiment whose tab you wear on your shoulder." He took a step toward Cutler, who seemed to shrink inside his uniform. "This NCO served in Grenada. She was on the ground in Mogadishu in '93. She led soldiers in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, back when the official policy said women weren't allowed in combat. She didn't just meet the standard. For decades, she was the standard. She has trained, led, and mentored more sergeants major than most of you have ever met. The doctrine on small unit tactics you studied at NCOES. She helped write it. The TTPs for close quarters battle your platoon practices. She bled for them. She is a living legend. And you, Staff Sergeant, mistook her for a lost spouse." The general paused, letting the weight of his words settle on the room. Soldiers stared at Bessie with a new profound sense of awe. They weren't looking at an old woman anymore. They were looking at a monument. They saw the gray hair and the red jacket, but now they understood that beneath it was a framework of tempered steel. The brigade command sergeant major stepped forward. She looked from Bessie to Cutler, her expression one of deep professional disappointment. "Staff Sergeant," she said, her voice cutting and precise. "You had a duty to verify credentials and maintain security. You failed. You didn't fail because you followed procedure. You failed because you made an assumption based on age and gender. You saw an old woman, not a soldier. You saw a civilian, not a command sergeant major. You let your bias blind you to what was standing right in front of you. There is no excuse for that. Not in my army." Cutler's face was ashen. He could only manage a choked, "No excuse, Sergeant Major." It was then that Bessie spoke, her calm voice drawing every ounce of attention in the tent. She looked not at the general or the disgraced ranger but at the faces of the younger soldiers watching. "The general and the sergeant major are correct," she began, her tone measured and instructive, not vengeful. "But the lesson here is not about me. It's about the standard. We have one standard of competence in the United States Army. It is a hard, unforgiving standard as it should be. It does not bend for gender. It does not soften for age. It does not care what you look like. It only cares what you can do." She took a small step forward, her presence seeming to fill the tent. "Your job as leaders is not to protect people from the standard. It is to apply it, to everyone, with absolute and unwavering fairness. Do not look at a soldier and see a man or a woman. Do not see young or old. See a soldier. Measure them by their performance, their character, their contribution to the mission. Gray hair doesn't mean you're obsolete. It means you've survived things that broke younger, stronger people. Experience doesn't expire." As she spoke of survival, another memory, sharper and more visceral than the first, flashed in her mind's eye. The coppery smell of blood filling a cramped, dust-choked room in Fallujah. The frantic, desperate work under the dim light of a chemstick. Her hands, then much younger but just as steady, packing a wound on a young Marine who was fading fast. The memory wasn't about glory. It was about the brutal, tangible price of experience. It was the foundation of the wisdom she was now sharing. The general gestured to Cutler. "First Sergeant Rodriguez," he called out. Rodriguez stepped forward from the back of the tent. "Take this NCO outside. I believe you and the brigade sergeant major have a professional development session to conduct with him. Immediately." "Hua, sir," Rodriguez said, his face grim. He placed a hand on Cutler's shoulder and guided the stunned ranger out of the tent. The immediate aftermath was a flurry of controlled, corrective action. General Merik personally escorted Bessie to his command vehicle. Within the hour, a directive was issued from the task force commander. Mandatory, command-directed training on unconscious bias and equal opportunity, with a specific block of instruction on the contributions of women and senior veterans, was scheduled for the entire task force during the next training stand-down. The story of what happened in the AANDP tent spread through the exercise like wildfire. A cautionary tale that would be told in NCO circles for years. A few days later, the initial phases of the exercise were complete. Bessie was standing in a long, dusty line for evening chow, holding a tray. She saw Staff Sergeant Cutler a few places ahead of her. When he got his food, he didn't go to the tables where his ranger buddies were sitting. He walked directly over to her, his tray held in unsteady hands. He stopped in front of her and stood at a formal position of parade rest. His face was etched with a humility she had not seen before. "Sergeant Major," he said, his voice quiet and strained. He looked her directly in the eye. "I have no excuse for my conduct. My actions were unprofessional, disrespectful, and a failure of everything I've been taught as a leader and a ranger. I was arrogant, and I was wrong. I apologize." Bessie looked at him for a long moment, studying his face. She saw genuine remorse there, the painful dawn of self-awareness. She gave a small nod. "The first step to learning, Sergeant, is admitting you were wrong. You've done that. The next step is more difficult." "What is it, Sergeant Major?" he asked earnestly. "To learn to see," she said simply. "When you look at your soldiers, don't just see their rank or their uniform. See their potential, see their history, see the person. You get more out of them that way, and you avoid making mistakes that can cost you a lot more than just your pride." She gestured to an empty spot at a nearby table. "Now go on and eat, Sergeant. You've got a long career ahead of you. Best not to face it on an empty stomach." Cutler hesitated, then nodded, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. He went and sat down, alone to contemplate the most profound lesson of his young career. Bessie got her food and sat with a group of young lieutenants. listening quietly as they talked about their plans for the next day's assault, her presence a silent, powerful reminder of the long, unbroken line of service they were all now a part of. If you were inspired by Command Sergeant Major Thornton's story of quiet strength and unwavering standards, please like this video and share it with someone who respects our nation's pioneers. Subscribe to She Chose Valor for more stories honoring the women who have served and continue to serve with distinction.